Dr. Ryan Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's an author of several books and the founder and editor of Public Discourse. He has published in numerous journals and newspapers, and his current research focuses on gender identity. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Anderson.
I want to thank you all for coming, thank the organizers for putting this together, especially thank the bishops from all the dioceses in Minnesota who are here today to take an entire day out of your schedule. Shows a great commitment to those people who are suffering from gender dysphoria and with struggles with their gender identity. I think this entire conference is devoted to helping all of us think more carefully about what we can do to help people who are suffering. And my contribution to that is to think through some of the underlying worldview judgments that are being made, particularly worldview judgments by activists who are part of the LGBT community. So at the very beginning, I want to distinguish people who identify as LGBT, people who struggle with gender dysphoria, people who have transitioned from the activists who are promoting a certain worldview. Because many of the people themselves who struggle with gender dysphoria, who identify as transgender, wouldn't embrace many of the claims that various activists make. And it's the claims of the activists that shape how people interpret their own lives, how they interpret their own experiences, how they interpret their own feelings. And so we all do this. We have various experiences in life and we think, well, what do they mean? What should I do about them? And there's a background script. And it's either going to be a true script, we're going to interpret our own lives and experiences and feelings in accordance with reality, or we're going to have a different script, a different narrative, a different worldview. And so that's what I want to address today. I'm going to find a place to put my iPad where it won't fall. Sorry about that. America's in the midst of what's been called a transgender moment. Not long ago, most Americans, I would imagine most people in this auditorium, hadn't really thought much about issues of gender identity, hadn't really heard much about transgender identities. And yet within the space of a year or two, it became a cause claiming the mantle of civil rights. So that a discordant gender identity is said to represent who a person really is, by contrast with the sex that's merely assigned at birth. And therefore, any failure to accept and to support a transgender identity amounts to bigotry. But is it true that a boy can be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex merely assigned to us? Can modern medicine really reassign sex? What's the most loving and helpful response to the condition of gender dysphoria? These shouldn't be difficult questions. In the late 1970s, Dr. Paul Mchugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of his professional colleagues not to go along with some of the claims that were being advanced by transgender activists. Mchugh had received a world-class education at Harvard College as an undergraduate and then at Harvard Medical School. And then he became the psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Medical School, at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the chair of the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins Medical School. So he's the chief psychiatrist at one of the world's leading institutions. And back in 1979, he put an end to sex reassignment procedures at that institution. And then many of his colleagues at neighboring institutions followed his lead. But sadly, recent years have seen a resurgence of these procedures, not in light of new scientific evidence, but because of ideology. And so the people increasingly in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. In 2007, so just 10 years ago, Boston Children's Hospital became, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents, end quote, as its website brags. A decade later, so today, there are now more than 45 pediatric gender clinics that have opened their doors to our nation's children. Parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Never mind that the best studies of gender dysphoria, studies that even activists cite show that somewhere between 80 and 95% of children with gender dysphoria will naturally grow out of it and will resolve with their bodily sex. Never mind that transitioning treatments have not been shown to reduce the extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts among people who identify as transgender. 41% of people who identify as transgender will attempt suicide at some point in their lives, compared with 4.6% in the general population, so 10 times more likely to attempt suicide. And never mind that people who have had their sex surgically reassigned are 19 times more likely to die by suicide. These statistics should stop us in our tracks. There is a community of our neighbors who are suffering, and they are not receiving the support that they need and that they deserve. And so there's a role here for us as the Christian community to be truth tellers and to be supporting people who are struggling with their own bodies, their own identities. So I first want to say a little bit more about how to understand the current transgender moment. And so I want to say a word about transgender ontology, transgender medicine, and then transgender policy. And ontology is just the big word that philosophers use for being, for who and what we are, anthropology, metaphysics. And people claim that we live in a post-metaphysical era. The modern era has rejected metaphysics, and that's not quite right. We simply live in a postmodern age that promotes an alternative metaphysics. And so at the heart of the transgender moment are radical claims about the human person. In particular, that people are who they claim to be. So that a transgender boy is a boy, not a girl who identifies as a boy. And it's understandable why activists make these claims. An argument about transgender identities will be much more persuasive if it's about who someone is, not merely how someone identifies. And so you'll see the rhetoric of many of the activists is oozing with ontological, metaphysical, anthropological claims. And they're all about what John Paul had identified as the crisis of the 20th century, the nature of the human person. Now, frequently, activists won't claim that they're making metaphysical claims. They'll dress it up as science rather than think about these things at the level of philosophy. So here I do want to give one example of that. Let me get to the next slide. There we go. This is from Dr. Deanna Atkins. She's a professor at Duke University School of Medicine, and she's the director of the Duke Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care, which opened just 2 years ago, to show you how recently these developments are. And in an expert deposition that she gave to a federal court in North Carolina about the North Carolina bathroom bill, she said, quote, "From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity." She then continued, "It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female." My Ph.D. is in political philosophy, so I might be ignorant about this, but I always thought that chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics were the bread and butter of medical science. And here we have expert testimony before a federal court saying it's contrary to medical science to rely on those things for determining sex, that gender identity now is the determinant of sex. It's not just professors making these claims in court. This worldview is also being promoted for many of our nation's children. So this is known as the gender-bred person. And as you can see in this graphic, it's meant to be a cartoon character. It's meant to be child-friendly. This is being used in kindergartens and elementary schools across the United States to describe a certain vision of the human person, a certain anthropology. And so you'll see that there's something that they describe as gender identity. And since the font is small, I'll read it to you. How you, in your head, define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. The graphic then lists 4, quote, of infinite possibilities for gender identity, including womanness, manness, two-spirit, and genderqueer. But the activists argue that gender is a spectrum, so that you could be male, female, both, neither, or something else altogether. So that's gender identity. Second, it lists gender expression, which is, quote, the way you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. This can be feminine or masculine, butch, femme, androgynous, or gender neutral, among the various options that are offered. Then there's biological sex, the third characteristic. In a moment, you'll see that this got the genderbread person into trouble for claiming that there's something known as biological sex. And then they have sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to. So they separate sexual orientation into two categories. And this is being used to catechize public school children into how to think about their own gender identity, their own sexual orientation, their own body. So there's a theology of the body being taught, and frequently it's not John Paul's, it's the genderbread person. This is the new catechetical tool that is used. It's called the gender unicorn. And there were two important revisions that were made for the gender unicorn from the genderbread person. One complaint was that the genderbread person looked too much like a man. So they're using a gender unicorn so it's not part of the patriarchy. And then second, you'll notice that there's no longer biological sex. There's now something known as sex assigned at birth. Even the genderbread person hadn't caught up to the latest requirement of political correctness on gender identity. And so the gender unicorn shows you these 5 different options that you can have. So that's transgender ontology, the vision of who the person is. I want to go through something that Walt touched on, which is the standards of care that have been developed by WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And this is the standard of care for children. And that's where I think we in particular need to be concerned. The first aspect is that children as young as age 3 should be socially transitioned if they express a gender identity that's persistent, consistent, and insistent. And that triad, persistent, insistent, and consistent, is how gender dysphoria is supposed to be recognized by parents and teachers and guidance counselors. And so if your child is persistent, insistent, and consistent about their gender identity, and that it's at odds with their, quote, sex assigned at birth, you should give your child a new name, refer to your child by new pronouns, give your child a new wardrobe, and then have your child use the new facilities appropriate for that gender identity, a new bathroom, a new locker room, a new sports team. That's part of what was behind that Dear Colleague letter from a year and a half ago, when the previous presidential administration sent a Dear Colleague letter to all of the nation's public schools, telling them to open up bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, dorm rooms based upon gender identity, not biology. It was part of the first step of this standard of care, which is that children as young as 2 and 3 to be socially transitioned into their new gender identity. The second step, as a child approaches puberty, is for a child around age 8, 9, or 10 to be placed on puberty-blocking drugs. These were drugs that were developed to prevent precocious puberty, puberty that develops too young. So children who were going through puberty at age 5, 6, or 7, doctors developed a drug that would delay puberty to an age-appropriate time. Physicians are now prescribing these drugs. They're not FDA approved, so they're being prescribed off-label to indefinitely delay puberty from developing at an age-appropriate time. So 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds are being placed in puberty. And the idea here is to prevent a child from, quote, going through puberty in the wrong body. Think about Dr. Adkins' statement, because the medicine follows from the ontology. If a child's sex is determined by gender identity, not chromosomes or hormones or internal organs or external genitalia, then to develop as a boy when your gender identity is a girl is to go through puberty in the wrong body. And so they'll place children into puberty-blocking drugs. Then currently, the age recommended is age 16, but some doctors are arguing this should be lowered to age 14. Adolescents are placed on cross-sex hormones. So a 16-year-old boy would be administered estrogen to start feminizing his body, and a 16-year-old girl would be administered testosterone to start masculizing her body. They want to start this younger, around age 14, because they're saying that when all the other children are going through puberty appropriate for their body, but transgender children aren't, that's what creates some of the psychological problems. And so if we could mimic puberty of the appropriate body earlier in life, we could help them feel more comfortable in their new identity. Then at age 18, sex reassignment surgery is available. It's not recommended for everyone. Some people, the social transition and the cross-sex hormones proves to be sufficient according to this standard of care for their gender dysphoria. But for other people, the standard of care, the fourth step, would be sex reassignment surgery. That can include what's known as top surgery and or bottom surgery. I'm not going to get into the details of what all is done. You can look this up online. Needless to say, many aspects of this standard of care are irreversible. That when people do later in life decide to detransition, they can only restore so much once organs, both internal and external, have been removed. So that's the transgender medicine. Transgender policy. This more or less follows from the ontology as well. The basic idea is that each and every individual should be treated as the gender identity that they assert rather than biology. So when it comes to bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, dorm rooms, students and adults should be treated according to their gender identity, not the biological differences between male and female. This also applies to healthcare policy. Thankfully, there was an order of nuns who won a lawsuit exactly a year ago. It was on New Year's Eve last year because there was an Obamacare mandate that would have required every healthcare plan in the United States to cover sex reassignment therapies and every relevant physician to perform them. This didn't get nearly as much attention as the Little Sisters of the Poor and the contraception mandate because it was only promulgated in May of 2016. So with 6 months left in office, the Obama administration reinterpreted an aspect of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and it was going to make every healthcare plan cover these hormone treatments and surgeries, and every relevant physician perform them. So if you are a surgeon who performs hysterectomies or mastectomies due to cancer, you would have to perform them to reassign sex. If you're an endocrinologist that does testosterone and estrogen treatment for deficiencies in those sex hormones, you would have to do them to reassign sex. This mandate had no exemption for religious liberty, no exemption for the rights of conscience, no exemptions simply for best medical judgment. There are many physicians, many of them not feeling safe and free to speak out publicly, but many of them simply think this is bad medicine. Apart from any religious or moral considerations, they think the appropriate treatment for gender dysphoria is a psychological and psychiatrical treatment, not a hormonal and surgical treatment. And so they were going to be at risk. Thankfully, just a year ago, a federal judge put a halt to that mandate, and then the Trump administration has rescinded it, has reversed course. So what to think about this? What to think about the worldview, the ontology, the medicine, and the policy? As I've been researching this, and I've just finished writing a book, which will come out in February on these questions, the best I can understand is to say that the transgender worldview combines a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism, in which the real self is something other than a material body, while at the same time embracing materialism, in which nothing but material bodies exist. There's a series of contradictions that I want to highlight in the transgender worldview because activists will opportunistically rely on one or the other of these opposing claims. On the one hand, the real self is something other than the material body, but on the other hand, only material bodies exist because we've given up on superstitions about souls or spirits or God. So simultaneously, materialism and Gnosticism. The transgender worldview relies on rigid sex stereotypes in which girls play with dolls and boys play with trucks. Yet it insists that gender is, quote, purely a social construct, and thus that there are no meaningful differences between man and woman, all the while insisting that gender identity is real and meaningful, but human embodiment is not. This worldview, it embraces a radical expressive individualism where people should be free to do whatever they want and to define the truth however they want, but it enforces a ruthless paternalism to coerce anyone who dares dissent from transgender ideology. So I want to raise a series of questions to get at some of these contradictions. If gender is a social construct, how can gender identity be innate and immutable? That is, how can one's identity with respect to a social construct be determined by biology in the womb? And how can one's identity be unchangeable, immutable, the term of art, with respect to an ever-changing social construct? So the challenge for those who embrace a transgender worldview is to offer a meaningful definition of gender and gender identity independent of bodily sex. But what does it even mean? That's an ontological set of questions. Here's an epistemological set. What does it even mean to have an internal sense of gender? What does gender feel like? So again, apart from a body, what meaning can we give to the concept of sex or gender? And therefore, what internal sense of sex or gender can we have? Put this more concretely, apart from having a male body, apart from being a male body, what does it feel like to be a man? Apart from having a female body, what does it feel like to be a woman? How would any of us who have male bodies know what it is to feel like a woman? And how could any of you that have female bodies know what it's like to feel like a man, apart from sex stereotypes? I'll put this more pointedly. What would it feel like to be both a man and a woman, or to be neither? There are epistemological questions here that I think are unanswerable. One last set of questions. Why should feeling like a man make someone a man? That is, why would our feelings determine reality on the question of sex, where they don't determine reality on almost anything else? After all, our feelings don't determine our age or our height. Very few are the people who are willing to go along with Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who identifies as Black. So if someone who identifies as transgender is the sex with which they identify, why isn't someone the race with which they identify? And what about people who identify as animals or able-bodied people who identify as disabled? And that's not meant to be a reductio ad absurdum. There are people who are currently undergoing surgical procedures to transform their bodies into various animals. And again, these are things you can look up online, news reports of people transforming themselves into dragons and into birds, able-bodied people having surgery to make them disabled. Very few people would suggest that that's a good use of medicine in those cases. What is it about gender identity that makes this any difference? We're not in favor of species reassignment surgery. We're not in favor of amputations for trans-abled people. So since we're at St. Thomas, to a certain extent, gender identity sounds a lot like religious identity. Here's what I mean by that. Identities that are determined by beliefs. But just like religion, our beliefs don't determine reality. Someone who identifies as a Christian believes that Jesus is the Christ. Someone who identifies as a Muslim believes that Muhammad is the prophet. But Jesus either is or is not the Christ, regardless of what any of us believe. And likewise, Muhammad either is or is not the prophet, regardless of what any of us happen to believe. The entire point about religious faith is to conform our beliefs to the truth. Our beliefs don't determine the truth, but the entire point of the religious life and of conversion is to come to discover the truth and then conform our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions in accordance with the truth. So in the same way that Jesus either is or is not the Christ, regardless of anyone's belief, so too I either am a man or am not a man, regardless of anyone's beliefs, including my own beliefs. I can have mistaken beliefs about myself. It would be the purpose of medicine and of a sound culture to help me return to true beliefs and to have me feel comfortable in my own body and with my own flesh. Walt did such a good job with his presentation this morning that I'm tempted to skip over what I'm about to say, but so I'll just say very briefly that the most difficult chapter for me to research and write in my new book was the stories of people like Walt who have transitioned and detransitioned. Because these are heartbreaking stories, because these are people who were not activists of any sort. They were not ideologues of any sort. They've been victimized by the activists and the ideologues. They were sold a series of lies about what would restore them to health and to wholeness. They placed their trust into these professionals. At first, they were happy with it frequently. Listening to Walt's story, for a while it was going well, and then only later does he come to realize that that wasn't what he was seeking, and he needed some other form of therapy. These stories, they complicate the pictures, the sunny picture that the media wants to present. It'll be very unlikely that Walt will have a 2-hour special in 2020 with Diane Sawyer, the way that Bruce Jenner did before he became Caitlyn. It's very unlikely that Walt will have a cover photo on Vanity Fair, the way that Caitlyn did. And so the vast majority of Americans have never heard stories like Walt's. And they don't know some of those tragedies. And so let me just read you one quote. I had 3 here, so I'll skip the first 2, just go to the last one. I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real live people. This is the outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality. This is a woman who made a YouTube video. There's been several people who have detransitioned who have told their stories either through blogs or through YouTube. She transitioned when she was 17 years old and then detransitioned at 22. So for 5 years, she was on testosterone. She had her breasts surgically removed. She now has a 5 o'clock shadow and a broken voice. That's the outcome when a culture gets these questions wrong. All right, so in the time I have left, I've done the first part of the title of Understanding the Transgender Moment. Let me get to some of the second part of responding to it. And this will, to a certain extent, start to summarize what I think the rest of this day's speakers will be covering in greater detail. So this is kind of a preview, to a certain extent, of what's to come. And then it's some promissory notes of what we as the people of God need to do, what the church needs to do. First is a sound understanding of gender identity, is that gender is how we express our sex. So sex is a biological reality, and gender is the social expression of that biological reality. Apart from that connection to the body, you can't give meaning to the concept of gender. And so sex as a bodily reality, this is why it's not surprising that sex reassignment surgeries fail to produce psychological outcomes that are fulfilling. It's because it's impossible to surgically reassign sex. Sex as a bodily reality is something that's imprinted on every cell of our body, every system of our body. We are a sexed species from the moment of conception. If you are conceived with a functioning Y chromosome, you will develop into a man, with one exception of a hormonal disorder where you wouldn't actually be able to receive testosterone, in which case you would develop as a woman. But apart from that rare hormonal disorder, which would be a case of intersex disorders of sexual development. 99.9% of humans with a functioning Y chromosome will develop as a man. What this means is that Y chromosome initiates the formation of the male pattern of bodily organizations. Organisms are collections of organs that are organized for certain purposes. And so the distinction between a male member of a species and a female member of a species, and this is true regardless of the species, all mammalian species, the male will be organized so as to be able to deposit genetic material, sperm, to put it most explicitly, and then the female is organized so as to receive that genetic material and then to carry a child, to develop that child. This is an objective, valid way of objectively determining who is male, who is female, apart from feelings, apart from stereotypes, apart from who likes the color pink and who likes the color blue. This is based on an objective reality, that some of us have bodies that develop into a certain way of being organized for sexual reproduction, and some of us have bodies that are organized in the complementary way for sexual reproduction. Dr. Cretella is going to go through this in greater detail, but one way of understanding this is that sex as a noun, sex as an identity, is partly a reflection of the ability to engage in sex as an activity. You're a male based upon your ability to engage in the conjugal action as a man, and you're a female based upon your organizational capacity to engage in a conjugal act as a woman. That's the bright line. So it's not surprising that immediately after marriage had been redefined so that it lost sexual complementarity of a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, we immediately started to see the increase in gender identity and transgender ideology. Because if we can't say that male and female matter where they matter most, our sexual differentiation as male and female matter most precisely for that complementarity to unite as one flesh, then all that you're left with is stereotypes. Apart from the meaning of the body, the spousal, the nuptial meaning of the body, you're just going to be left with the stereotypes of who plays with dolls and who plays with trucks. So that's the sex part. The gender identity, human cultures have historically erred in one of two ways. The first way in which we erred was by having rigid sex stereotypes that frequently resulted in some form of patriarchy used generally, where we overestimated the abilities and the skills and the worth of men while we underestimated the ability and skills of women. And so you can have one extreme in which you have rigid sex stereotypes and frequently in a hierarchical relationship. Then we yo-yoed to the other extreme, in particular with second wave feminism, in which we sought to deny that there were any differences between male and female. And so you saw many second wave feminists saying that one's not born a woman, one becomes a woman. You saw various people saying, embracing a form of androgynous feminism. There are no differences between men and women. We're only socialized to think that there are differences. Gender is a social construct. And so all the differences between male and female are arbitrary, and many of them are arbitrarily constructed precisely to keep women in a position of subjugation. The most extreme of second wave feminists will even say that the female body itself is a social construct, and that it's unjust to have one member of the species carry the children for the other member of the species. And so it's not surprising that you see abortion intimately connected with a certain type of feminist thinking. The happy mean between these two extremes says that sex differences are real and they're meaningful in certain contexts, but that male and female are created equal in dignity and worth and in ability. But we do have different gifts, particularly when it comes to the parenting enterprise. And so Dr. Wilcox is going to talk about that later this afternoon, how mothers and fathers bring, on average and for the most part, different gifts to the parenting enterprise. One piece of work for our culture then would be to avoid the idea that boys can't be sensitive and girls can't be aggressive. When you look at the pediatricians who treat children with gender dysphoria, frequently the children have internalized an overly rigid understanding of what their sex is supposed to do. It's an overly rigid understanding of sex stereotypes. So because I'm a girl who plays with G.I. Joe, I must be a boy trapped in a girl's body. Because I'm a boy who plays with dolls, I must be a girl trapped in a boy's body. So in the beginning end of life, avoid that. Towards the adult end of life, avoid structuring our economy and our society on the assumption that the male body is the prototypical body. This will be the work for generations, but in many respects, our economy, our university system, our professional associations, medicine, and lawyers, it operates on the assumption that the male body is the normal way of being human. And so women are forced to conform their lives to the male way of being human, working a 9-to-5 schedule, competing for internships and postdocs and things like this, as if their fertility was a disease. And so one work here, and I think this was largely John Paul's work for a new feminism, was to say, how do we recognize the gifts of both sexes while also respecting their inherent equality and dignity? Let me close with this. John Paul, back when he was a bishop at the Second Vatican Council, he had identified the crisis of the 20th century as a crisis of faulty anthropologies. He looked out at the world, he saw the 2 world wars, he saw the 3 totalitarian regimes, he saw the Gulag, the Holocaust, all as ways in which 20th century got the human person wrong. He then extended that diagnosis in Evangelium Vitae when he looked out at abortion, and he said, we're getting the human person wrong. If John Paul was with us in the flesh, he's with us through the communion of saints today, but if he was with us in the flesh, he would tell us that gender ideology is another way in which now 21st century man has gotten the human person wrong. As I look at American culture, it'll be the church and only the church that will tell the truth on these issues. It won't be Hollywood, it won't be the mainstream media, it won't be the universities, it won't be big business, it won't be the politicians. It'll be you. And by church, I mean ordained and lay members. And the reason this matters is that the truth is what set us free. If you want to help people avoid the suffering that Walt had to go through, we each owe it to them to learn about the truth and then to be willing to speak the truth in a compassionate way. Thank you.